Hello, folks. I hope we're all well and happy. Okay, then. So, what we're going to look at today is the structure of Tsarist government. Okay, looking at the central government and the different organs that make up the central government. Now, before we do, for those of you who don't do politics and stuff, you think about the UK and Britain. The organs of central government in Britain is obviously you've got the Queen at the top, haven't you? You've then got the Prime Minister, who's our friend Boris, and there's his cabinet, his ministers, people like the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Home Secretary and the Education Secretary, all these sorts of people. Obviously, you've got Parliament, okay, which is the bit we elect, and they go to the Commons, don't they, in the House of Lords and go here, here, and all the rest of it. Okay, they are the organs of central government. Oh, of course, we've got the Supreme Court as well, the highest court of the land. So, when we talk about central government, that's what we mean. It's like the Prime Minister, the Chief Ministers, who run the government departments, these sorts of people. So, what we're going to look at today then is the Tsarist central government in Russia. We're going to have a look at, as well, I say we, I mean you, what happened in 1905 with the 1905 revolution, and then how that changed how the Tsars did government. Now, some bits of this are in the work booklet. I suggest that another bit's on an A3 sheet, which I'm going to send out to you as an A4 sheet. I suggest though you might want to take notes because there's like a diagram in your booklet comparing Tsarist and communist structures. What I would do is actually what I'm going to go through today. I would write out yourself and do. I copy that diagram, but write it out yourself on a bigger sheet and write all the details in. I'm going to go through some of the details of these organs. Page 26 of the Access to History book, which is on Moodle, has a diagram. It's got a bit more detail in as well about these bodies. I'm also using as part of my basis the PowerPoint on the structures of government. So at the very top of the structures of government section, the first, I'm going to basically use slides 5 and 6 to begin with. Then you're going to do some work on 1905, and then we're going to look at slides 7 and 8. Okay, so Tsarist central government 1855 to 1861. So this is the system which Alexander II upheld. Now, as we know, at the very top of this system, we've got the Tsar. He has complete control over all aspects of Russian government. He is the autocrat. Think about autocracy, this idea that the Tsar is put there by God, some like divine right. The Tsar decides all laws and all the rest of it. Think about how they did the emancipation of the serfs, for example. The Tsar passes an edict, doesn't it? An edict is basically an instruction saying, I want this to happen, and then the next day it happens. So the Tsar's got complete control over all aspects of government, but there are different organs within this government which he has complete control over. The first one is called the Personal Chancery. It's actually called the Personal Chancery of His Imperial Majesty. Okay, and there's 3 sections of this. It is basically there's like his personal secretaries who kind of write down what he wants them to write down. He has legal advisors, so people who tell him, well, this is what the law is at the moment, Your Majesty. If you want to change it, then this is how you need to do it, etc., etc. And then the secret police. And the reason why they called the third section the secret police under Alexander II and previous Tsars is because it's the third section of this particular organ of government. Now, in 1861, Alexander decides to basically get rid of this personal chancery of the Imperial Majesty, and he renames it the Council of Ministers. Okay, which is rather confusing, as we will find out shortly. Okay, the other organ of government which he inherits is the Council of Ministers. Okay, now the Council of Ministers was chaired by the Tsar, and the officials of this organ of government, they drafted legislation, they drafted laws. So the Tsar would say, oh no, I want a law on this. And then the people in this kind of body, they would kind of write down the ins and outs as to how it should be and all the rest of it. Now, what Alexander does, essentially, the personal chancery is kind of merged, I suppose, with this group. And if you look at it, they kind of did similar roles. So that the personal chancery had those legal advisors, for example. Well, they were basically doing what the Council of Ministers was doing. So what Alexander does, he basically merges the personal chancery with the Council of Ministers. So under Alexander II, you have the Council of Ministers, and basically what it does is it drafts laws. So like think about the emancipation of the serfs, for example. The Tsar doesn't need to know all the legal kind of wording. He says, I want the serfs to be emancipated. I want them to pay some payments. I want them to do this. I want this. I want that. And then this body of people will then, I want to say type out. They wouldn't type it out, would they? Well, they're not doing actually in 1860s. Anyway, they'd write up the laws, they'd look at all the legal words and put all the legal terminology in there, and say to the magistrate, here you are, here's the edict, this is what it looks like in legal terms. The Tsar has a read through, said, oh yeah, that seems all right, okay, signs it, it then becomes law, essentially. In 1882, Alexander III gets rid of the Council of Ministers, okay, and what he does, he splits it all up to all the other organs of government. So the Council of Ministers writes up the laws in legalistic terms, I suppose, and then Alexander III in 1882, I don't know what date it is, he gets rid of it, essentially, and as we'll talk about in a few moments. Okay then, other organs of the government is the Imperial Council of State. Okay, this basically advises the Tsar on finance and law. Now, one historian, it's in the textbook, Peter Waldron, he referred to it as a retirement home for old government servants. So they're appointed by the Tsar. The Tsar doesn't take any notice of them, and judging by that quotation, they're basically old duffers, essentially, who've kind of been given a job out of grace and favour, I suppose. So the Tsar could take absolutely no notice of this group if he so wishes. You've also got Russia's Supreme Court, which is the highest legal body in the country, and it's called the Senate, which again is rather confusing. And it's basically the final court of appeal. So if you think you've been justice hasn't been done or whatever, for whatever purpose, this is the final court. Now, we already know from we did Alexander II that he does make significant legal changes. And we know from the system we inherit, the law is rather, how should we put it nicely, not well equipped. Remember all those judges who couldn't read and all that kind of, didn't know what law was and all that kind of stuff, and all those harsh punishments. And he makes all these changes, doesn't he? So Russia's highest court, again, in the early years, it'd only be the richest people who could afford to do this. You probably had mainly counts and stuff, disputing land with other counts and dukes and all the rest of it. And this Senate for the Supreme Court, it maintains its role as kind of arbitrating miscarriages of justice and that type of stuff. Again, it had been quite expensive to get to this stage, so I think in terms of its significance and role, it probably would be quite limited, and it probably would mainly affect those higher up in society who felt that, Judge Bladoblaski had made a wrong decision in giving their land to the neighbouring duke or whatever. Okay, so they're these organs. So you've got the Tsar at the top, you've got this personal chancery, who kind of makes his laws into legalistic speak, and the secret police are part of it. He gets rid of that in 1861 and he merges it with the Council of Ministers, who basically do the same job. Okay, you've got the Imperial Council of State, which is these old duffers who just said to the Tsar, or he asked them, I'd like some advice, please, on this, and they will go, oh, yes, okay. Okay, he can ignore them if he wants to. And then you've got the Supreme Court, which is called the Senate. Now, the most important organ, which I haven't mentioned yet, is on slide 6. It's the Committee of Ministers. This was set up by Alexander in 1861. And I suppose you want to think about it in British terms today, it's a bit like our cabinet. So basically, there are 13 ministers So like today in Britain, we've got 22 in the cabinet. So we've got like the Secretary of State for Education, who's Gavin Williamson. We've got the Chancellor of the Exchequer. We've got the Home Secretary, the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Secretary of State for local government. You know, there's 22 of them. Well, in 1861, there were 13 of these people in Alexander II's government. Interestingly, they were reduced down to 10 by 1890s. Now, again, if you look at the Access to History book, it's quite funny because some of them are rather, how should we put this nicely, not the best kind of most important jobs. So, for example, there was one had a responsibility for state horse breeding, which is not exactly a major kind of issue, is it? I don't think, unless you're a horse, I suppose. There were, though, 4 jobs which seemed the top ones. Okay, and again, I suppose that's like in Britain, isn't it? In our current cabinet, you have like the Chancellor, you know, being like the second. You got the Prime Minister, then you got like the Chancellor, who's got a really important job, the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary. They're like the top jobs in UK government. Well, there were 4 in Russian government. You have the Minister of Interior. That's a bit like our Home Secretary, and he is responsible in Russia at this time for things like the police. I imagine when they got rid of that original Council of Ministers, the secret police would come under the control of the Minister of the Interior, law and order, all that type of stuff. You've got the Minister for War, which I think is fairly self-explanatory. Is responsible for war. Minister for Finance, that's like our Chancellor, so money, taxes, that type of stuff. And then the 4th important job, which again we don't have in Britain, is the Chief Procurator of the Holy Synod. This is links in with the Church and the Orthodox Church. And on Liz's thing, you got a picture there, because under Alexander III, the person who had this job was Mr. Pob. Maybe that guy with a name with about 400 letters in, Pob-Madensky, whatever his name is. Okay, Mr. Pob, this ultra-conservative under Alexander III, that was his job, basically. Okay, and he was responsible for all legal affairs. Now, these ministers, they were mainly administrative. So each minister had a department. So a bit like today in Britain. So like you got the Home Secretary. She has about 20 or 30,000 civil servants who work for her, and you know they kind of ensure the police are doing their job properly. They ensure that justice is being done, and all that type of administration. Well, these ministers were similar. They had an administration type of job. They weren't really decision makers. They did not formulate ideas and policies unless the Tsar asked them to. So the ministers basically did as they were told by the Tsar. So the Tsar might say, Minister for Interior, I want you to look at reforming the judiciary so this happens and that happens. And then the minister would kind of disappear for a bit and come back with his proposals, and the Tsar might say, oh, they're really good, I quite fancy introducing those. He might get them written up in legal speak from his council of ministers, or he might say, no, I don't like those ideas, and go away and do something else. They didn't meet up as a body very often, collectively, so the Tsar would ask them to come to see him in his palace. Well, they didn't do like what we do in Britain today, where the cabinet kind of meet every week and have a big chinwag for a couple of hours to decide what they're going to do. It's all very much the Tsar. They'll get a note from the Tsar saying, you know, the Tsar would like to see you at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Please come along, and he'd go along, have something to eat, have a chat to the Tsar, and then go again. So it was mainly they're kind of working on their own, these ministers, which did lead to problems because sometimes you found that they contradicted each other on certain things, especially over things like spending and taxes. So you might have the Minister for Finance, for example, might want to not raise taxes, but then you might have another minister, say the police, who wants to spend lots of money on police, and you could get conflicts and stuff like that. Okay. This committee was got rid of in 1906. Okay, and even more confusingly, Nicholas II in 1906 he gets rid of it, and he creates a new Council of Ministers, which is essentially the Committee of Ministers. Okay, but some of these jobs are given to the Duma as well. So don't get too bogged down in it. So essentially, the key thing you need to get out of this is that the Tsar's at the top is making all the decisions. His ministers, appointed by him, dismissed by him, is in the committee of ministers, and they meet him individually, and their job basically to do what the Tsar's told them to, okay, unless he asked them to come up with some ideas. You've then got the council of ministers, who are not really ministers, they're just civil servants who basically the Tsar says, I've got this new edict, can you make it all legalistic please? And they write it in legalistic speak. That's essentially the main organs of government, and of course you've got the Senate, which is like the highest court. Okay, now that system, as I said, there are a couple of little tweaks. Okay, so Alexander II in 1861 gets rid of the, I forget what it's called, the personal chancery of His Imperial Majesty. Alexander III in 1882 gets rid of the Council of Ministers. And as I've just said, Nicholas II reinstates the Council of Ministers and gets rid of the Committee of Ministers. Okay, it's basically just changing the names of, just changing the titles of these things. But the key thing is the Tsar's in charge, essentially, which is what you'd expect from autocracy. Now, the biggest change that came to this, and what you might want to do is perhaps pause this video now, just have a think about what I've said, write it up in a diagram form. So you got the diagram in your booklet, which has come from the textbook essentially. I'd write that out and put your own little writing on. Page 26 of Access to History book had a nice little summary. Okay, and as I said before, you don't need, it's because this will just be a paragraph in an essay, comparing this with the communist system, you can see you don't really need to know all the ins and outs. You just need to be able to tell me when we do paragraphs which these systems are kind of similar, what has changed or not changed. Okay, so there's been a few tweaks. Okay, the next bit then is about 1905. 1905 saw a big change, 1905, 1906, and you may have heard this phrase about the 1905 revolution. Now, the big famous revolution, which everyone knows about, is 1917, when the Tsar disappears and they end up with Lenin coming in at the end of 1917. But in 1905, there was another revolution. A lot of historians see it as being like the first one, so to speak, and the 1905 led to 1917, because Nicholas II basically didn't learn his lessons. So 1905, there was major political disturbances in Russia. What I'd like to do, I want to send you an email and I'll attach to what would have been an A3 sheet, but obviously it's not because it's not an A4 piece of paper. What you need to do is use chapter 5 of the Fane and Cohen book. It's on Moodle, it's in the structure of government section, it's about halfway down if I remember correctly. Use chapter 5 to complete that A3 sheet. You need to know what causes what's known as Bloody Sunday, what happened on Bloody Sunday, and then really importantly are the consequences of that revolution. Now, the box for the consequences is rather small. I think Liz could have done it a bit bigger. Perhaps split up the consequences. You need to tell me about what the October manifesto was, and then tell me about the fundamental laws of 1906 under Nicholas II. Okay, so if I were, I'll pause this video, do that work, and then what I'll do is I'll then talk about the next little bit, which I'd like to do. Okay, so assume you've done the A3 sheet. I won't go through it in great detail, but basically the causes of this uprising, for want of a better phrase, is basically, well, it was all started, wasn't it, by industrial action in this metal factory in St. Petersburg. But there are also other causes as well. So there were food shortages across Russia. There's an economic slump as well. And then there's some longer term causes as well. Things like, those financial reforms of people like Rutan and someone called Witt, who will come across later on, led to this big rise of industrial workers, etc., etc. Page 133 of the bit you had to read kind of has all the causes, long and short term. So basically, these strikers, they go to the Winter Palace, don't they, in their Sunday best. And they're expecting the Tsar, basically, the father of the nation. It shows they weren't opposed to him personally. they'd had a petition, didn't they? And basically they were expecting the Tsar to come out and say, thank you for the petition, I'll look at these very carefully and I'll make the necessary changes. Instead, the 20,000 protesters are met by troops who shoot at them. This has massive consequences for Nicholas II because basically it destroys, if you like, any loyalty or trust between the people and the Tsar. Okay, that affection they had, him being the father of the nation, perhaps being a little bit misguided, they now think he's a nasty bastard, essentially. You also saw widespread strikes as a consequence all across Russia. So St. Petersburg, Moscow, all the big cities of Russia saw industrial action. And it gets worse and worse. You see mutinies begin to take place on some of the battleships. So battleship Prince Potemkin in June 1905, the sailors say we ain't doing this anymore, and they basically go on strike. You see widespread disruption in the countryside. You see many peasants attacking landowners, houses and stuff. And then in the middle of all this, Russia formally loses the Russian-Japanese War, which is again an ultimate humiliation. So it has real bad consequences, and there's been some suggestions that the Tsar was actually briefly deposed in this period. He certainly, in October 1905, makes some massive concessions. In order to regain power and stay in power, especially his back's against the wall, he makes some major concessions. Firstly, he says that civil liberties will be introduced into Russia, and then he actually establishes a Duma. Duma is like a parliament. And now notice the phrase, it's a consultative assembly. Consultative means it's not like our parliament perhaps where it ultimately makes decisions, it's going to consult. It's a consultative assembly with legislative powers. So it's got some law-making abilities. Well, the word consultative, a bit of a giveaway, is in conjunction with the Tsar. Okay, so there's going to be some sharing of law-making powers. And this is an interesting one as well. It's going to supervise the legality of government. And in many respects, that is a fundamental element of autocracy. So, because obviously, he believes his legality comes from, his legal status comes from appointed by God. So by having this other institution supervising that, suggests he's no longer an autocrat. So he backs up against the wall and he's forced basically to make these concessions. Now by April 1906, so what, quick massive, 6 months later, he's obviously in a stronger position. Okay, the strikes have ended. It's managed to restore law and order into the countryside quite brutally, actually. A lot of people are executed and stuff in the countryside areas. And he then introduced what's called the fundamental laws. And essentially, it's rowing back some of the things from the October Manifesto. He can't get rid of the Dumas. He can't get rid of some of their powers. But he's basically trying to reassert his own authority. Now, page 140 and 141 of that chapter 5 lists A to G of the powers which the Tsar kind of says, these are mine. I won't go through all of them here, but he basically says that his powers come from God. He has got the sole law-making powers. Any law which the Duma passes or approves, it's not law until he says it's law. He can appoint and dismiss people as he pleases from his ministers. He's got the sole power to declare war. And if he wants to rule by decree, so if the Duma's on their holidays, he can then rule by decree. That's like doing the edicts of which, we know Alexander II is. That's where he says, this is what I want to do, this is the law, right, it's law now. So when Parliament's not in session, when the Duma's not in session, he'll just make law as and when he wants to, essentially. Now, it doesn't take a great genius to think, could he not just make the Duma go on a holiday for a long period of time and then pass a load of things which they don't like whilst they're on their holidays, making sandcastles and stuff? Okay, so there's an obvious kind of problem here, straight from the, I hate the face, I'm going to say the get-go, which is a bit I don't like. Okay, so if you look at Lizzie's PowerPoint again, slide 7 shows the new kind of configuration of central government. So we've got the Tsar at the top, okay, October Manifesto, strengthened by the fundamental laws, it's still got all these various powers. We've got the Committee of Ministers, which he then does rename the Council of Ministers rather confusingly, but don't worry about that too much. So again, this time, rather than the Tsar, so this time what they did in the Council and the Committee of Ministers, which he renamed the Council of Ministers, is that rather than coming to meet the Tsar independently, no, not independent, rather than coming to meet the Tsar on their own when they get like an instruction to come to see him, now they're going to meet up as a body more often. So all 10 ministers, however many it is, are going to meet up on a more regular basis together and make ideas a bit more collective. And rather than the Tsar chairing those meetings, it's going to be a prime minister who's been chosen by the Tsar, so he gets a yes man in. But basically, there's going to be a prime minister who chairs the meeting of these ministers. Okay, it's still largely administrative. Okay, but you can see the embryo here, can't you, of like what we have, where you have a prime minister, you have the ministers who meet up on a regular basis. You've then got this Duma. Okay, there's two elements of the Duma. There's like an upper house, a bit like our House of Lords, if you want to think about it in that way, of Parliament. Half of it is elected by the Tsar, so half the members of this are the Tsar's mates, I suppose. Half are elected by the landowners and the really wealthy industrialists. So they're going to be quite conservative, aren't they, with a small c. And they have a veto power over the Duma. So if the lower house passes or decides on something which the upper house don't like, then they'll just say, no, it's not going any further. That law's null and void. And you can see the Tsar, can't you? The Tsar's going to tell the 50% who he's appointed, oh, I don't like this law, can you make sure you kill it, please? You've then got the Duma, which is the lower house. Okay, it's elected. It's got few powers because all the laws need the approval of the Tsar and stuff, but at least it's there, you might argue. And then the Senate remained unchanged. Okay, so this is the biggest change that occurs under the Tsars with autocracy, the establishment of these Dumas, okay, these parliaments. Now, what I'd like to do is there's a table in the booklets, about 3 or 4 pages on, called the Dumas. Let me find the exact title. It is a good few pages on. Right there. It's after all the communist bits. It's after the summary. Dumas, read Corin and Fine, 48 to 51. Holland also has good summaries. You'll find this without Liz's A3 sheet, PowerPoint on Moodle also has a summary of this. Find out what these different Dumas did. Okay, so I'll leave you with all that. There's quite a lot there to kind of get your head around and get on with and stuff. So I think I'll stop it there. What I'll do on Thursday is I'll quickly go over that Duma stuff. I'll kind of summarise some of the similarities and differences, and then we'll have a look at the PG, the provisional government, and then, rather confusing, look at the communist system. Okay, any problems with any of that, let me know by email. Like I said, it's not the easiest bit. I would stop it a few times in this video, just try and get your head around it. But again, it's just a paragraph in an essay, so it's the broad similarities and differences that you really need to know. So make sure you do all that work, and I'll speak to you again on Thursday.